Judith Halley never asked for company, just quiet winds and stubborn soil at Painted Rock Ranch. But one dusk, a woman in a torn wedding dress stumbled through her fence barefoot, breathless, and bleeding. Evelyn didn't beg. She just said, "Please." Judith gave her a shirt, a cabin, and silence. But silence ain't safety, not when the man Evelyn fled owns half the county and thinks he owns her too. Now the ranch holds more than crops, it holds a question. What's stronger, the law of fear, or two women who won't kneel? And when Evelyn melts her wedding band into iron, will it hold? Judith Halley had seen storms blow through Painted Rock Ranch before dust devils howling down from the bluffs, tearing shingles from the barn roof, and scattering feed across the yard. But nothing in her 43 years prepared her for the storm that came hobbling through her south fence line at dusk, wearing white silk shredded like old curtain lace. The woman moved like a ghost who hadn't finished dying. Her wedding dress, if it had ever truly been one, hung from her shoulders in tatters, streaked with blood and desert dust. Her bare feet left no prints in the hard pan, but Judith saw the raw skin, the torn heel, the way her arms hugged her ribs as if holding herself together was the last thing she could still control. Judith had been hauling water from the pump when she saw her. She didn't call out, just watched, heart thudding, slow and heavy. The woman collapsed near the hitching post, her body folding, with no drama, no cry for help. Judith approached with the quiet care she used when calming a skittish mare. The woman didn't flinch. "You hurt?" Judith asked, voice low. The woman blinked up at her lips, cracked one eye swollen half shut. Her breath rattled like heat on tin. Judith didn't wait for an answer. She dropped to one knee and reached beneath the woman's arm. "Come on, I got a cot. And shade." The woman didn't resist. She didn't say thank you. She just leaned into Judith like a tree giving into wind. Judith led her to the bunkhouse, bare walls, a cot with 2 blankets, a wood stove untouched since last winter. She fetched a clean shirt, faded blue cotton, and left it folded at the end of the bed. "Wash up," Judith said. "There's a basin by the stove. Sleep if you can." She turned to go, but paused in the doorway. "What's your name?" The woman didn't lift her head. "Evelyn," she rasped. Judith the rancher replied, then left her in peace. That night, Judith sat on the porch steps of her own cabin, watching the stars blink to life like timid eyes. Painted Rock had been hers since her husband died 5 years back. His name still carved into the post by the barn. No children, no visitors. She liked it that way. But Evelyn Kearns had stumbled into her land like a secret carried on the wind. She didn't need to ask where the girl had come from. There was only one wedding party large enough this week to send dust clear to Judith's Ridge. The Whitford affair held 3 miles south, under rented lanterns and hired fiddlers. She hadn't been invited. Wouldn't have gone if she was. Everyone knew Charles Whitford's ranch spanned more land than sense. Folks said he had bought his bride from some desperate family out east, waving cattle money like it was scripture. Judith hadn't paid it mind, not until Evelyn ran in that dress. She heard movement in the bunkhouse, the soft creak of floorboards, then silence again. Judith leaned back and let the night fold around her like a worn quilt. Her hand drifted to the rifle resting by the door. If Evelyn had fled Charles, then it meant one thing: trouble wasn't far behind. By morning, Evelyn hadn't moved from the cot. Judith found the shirt still folded untouched, and the woman curled like a leaf beside it. Her hands were calloused beneath the bruises she'd worked before, that much was clear. Not some porcelain girl used to being carried. Judith laid down a tin cup of water, a biscuit, and a boiled egg. No words. When she stepped out into the sun, she saw the first sign of what was coming. Hoof prints in the sand, fresh, headed west to east. 5 horses, 2 riders. Judith's jaw tightened. Evelyn hadn't brought just a storm. She'd brought a reckoning, and it was already circling. The knock came before breakfast. Judith was stirring beans on the stove when she heard it. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, unhurried. Like whoever stood outside knew they didn't need to ask permission. She opened the door slow. The man on her porch wore money like a second skin. Polished boots, a spotless waistcoat too fine for ranch land, and a silver watch chain glinting against the morning sun. His dark mustache twitched as he smiled. "Morning, Miss Halley," he drawled. "Mind if we step inside?" Judith didn't smile. "Depends who we is." A taller man appeared behind him, rougher broad across the shoulders, sleeves rolled up, hat tipped low. Benton. She remembered him from the auction yard, Whitford's right hand and wrong conscience. The first man took off his hat, revealing slicked hair and colder eyes. "I'm Charles Whitford. Think you might have something of mine." Judith stepped out, shutting the door behind her. "Don't own much worth stealing." "She ran from her own wedding," Whitford said, voice smooth as oil. "Half a county saw it. Folks say she came this way." Judith folded her arms. "Folks say a lot of things." Benton shifted his weight, his stare crawling over the bunkhouse behind her like a snake scenting warmth. Whitford's smile turned thinner. "Now, I'm a reasonable man. I don't want a scene. But Evelyn's my wife by contract. That makes this a retrieval." Judith's gaze didn't waver. "You file papers with livestock too." A flicker of something dangerous passed through Whitford's expression. Benton stepped forward, but Judith turned slow and opened the bunkhouse door behind her. Evelyn stood just inside. She wore Judith's shirt, now too big and the shoulder sleeves rolled, but her spine was straight and her face held. "I'm not going back," she said. Quiet but clear, Whitford's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't get to decide that. I just did." Benton moved toward the steps, but Judith raised her hand. "You take one more step and I'll holler loud enough to wake the sheriff. He's not partial to trespassers." Whitford held up a finger to stop Benton. "This ain't over," he said. "You've made a mistake, both of you." Judith didn't flinch. "Then go fix it somewhere else." They rode off slow like men who wanted to be watched. Dust curled in their wake. That evening, Evelyn sat on the porch, bare feet tucked beneath her. Judith brought her a tin mug of sweet tea and set it down without comment. They watched the sun dip below the buttes. "Thank you," Evelyn said finally. Judith sipped her tea. "You don't owe me." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "He didn't hit me, not with fists, but he talked like I was something he'd bought, like I'd cost too much to return." Judith nodded. "Sounds about right for a man like Whitford. I thought if I stayed quiet, followed rules, I could survive it." She paused. Then I saw the dress in the mirror. Looked like a noose. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Judith stood, walked inside, and returned with an old rifle. "Ever fired one?" she asked. Evelyn blinked. "No." "Then it's time you learned." They spent the next hour out behind the barn, aiming at a bottle perched on the fence post. Evelyn's hands shook at first, but Judith's voice stayed calm, steady. By the fifth shot, the bottle exploded in a clean crack of glass. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. "That felt like something, like freedom," Judith said. They walked back in the cooling dark side by side. Inside, Evelyn placed the rifle carefully beside the bunkhouse door, the same place she'd once left her tattered gown. And somewhere between the shifting desert winds and the hiss of twilight crickets, Evelyn realized something that startled her more than any gunfire. She didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. But fear wasn't the only thing Charles Whitford planned to send. Not when power, real or imagined, was slipping from his grip. And in a town as small as Mesa Ridge, gossip moved faster than law. By morning, they'd be called harborers, worse thieves. And the whispers had already begun. 2 days after Whitford's visit, Judith rode into Mesa Ridge with dust on her boots and a purpose in her spine. Evelyn stayed behind chopping kindling, her sleeves rolled high and her nerves riding a thread. Judith didn't say much that morning, but her eyes had a hard glint, the kind that meant she wasn't about to wait for trouble to knock twice. The town was quiet as usual, too quiet maybe. Folks glanced her way from under brims and behind storefront glass. Whispers traveled quicker than stagecoaches out here, and by now everyone had heard the tale Judith Halley had taken in Charles Whitford's bride. And not just taken in, was hiding her, shielding her, standing square between a rich man and what he claimed was his. Judith tied her horse outside the old general store and walked 2 doors down to the notary office, a weathered building with a green-painted sign that read, "Hazel Partridge, Legal Registrar, Deeds and Records, since 1878. Inside it smelled like lemon oil and dust. Hazel looked up from her desk and squinted. "Well now, ain't seen you in a long time, Judith." Judith removed her hat. Didn't have reason until now. Hazel leaned back, brushing a curl of white hair from her forehead. This about the Kearns girl, Judith didn't flinch. "I need to look at the marriage filing Charles Whitford submitted. Official copy. And I'd like to know if it holds." Hazel blinked. "You're not kin." "I'm her witness," Judith said evenly. "More than she ever had when that contract got signed." Hazel hesitated, then pulled open a drawer with a soft clatter. "Fine, but only 'cause I don't much care for how he walks around like he owns people." The papers were filed proper at first glance. Name, signatures, date. But Judith caught something a line at the bottom, marked Registrar's affirmation left unsigned. Hazel traced it with one gnarled finger. Well, I'll be. That blank right there means it was never finalized. Judith raised her eyes. So legally, she's not his wife. Hazel confirmed, not by Arizona law. Ceremony or not, it ain't binding without the registrar's seal. Judith nodded quiet. Hazel looked at her for a long beat. You stirring up something big, Jude? I ain't the one who stirred it, but I'll damn well stand in it if I have to. By the time she returned to the ranch, the wind had picked up. Evelyn met her at the gate, eyes scanning Judith's face before asking anything. Well, not legal, Judith said, dismounting. Not even close. Evelyn let out a breath that trembled like glass on the edge of a shelf. But that don't mean he'll stop, Judith added. I know. They stood in the fading light. The desert wind kicked grit into the air. Behind them, the fields lay still waiting. Evelyn hesitated. He told folks he had a right to me, like I was a piece of paper he owned. Judith studied her. Then it's time you had a paper of your own. That evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, with Hazel's notarized letter in front of her, a document declaring her unbound, free by law and by name. Judith placed a pen in her hand. Sign it, she said. You're not someone's property. You're someone. Evelyn's fingers hovered. Haven't signed my own name in years. Then make it count. She wrote slowly, Evelyn Louise Kearns. The ink bled into the parchment like roots finding dirt. Outside, coyotes howled across the ridge, but inside, Evelyn's breath came steady. Still, neither of them was fool enough to think paper alone would stop Charles Whitford. He didn't need law to hold power. He had money men and fear. Judith stood and lit the lamp by the window. Let him come, she said. We've got truth on our side. Evelyn folded the letter into her palm like armor. Truth didn't rattle like guns, but in the right hands, it struck deeper. And tomorrow, the whole town would see who still held the reins. The Mesa Ridge Spring Picnic had always been a town tradition. Wagon rides, fiddle tunes, cornbread contests, and enough sunburn to last through June. It was a place for families for handshakes and lemonade for gossip, dressed up in Sunday smiles. Judith Halley hadn't attended in 3 years. But this time she showed up with Evelyn Kearns beside her. They came on foot, walking shoulder to shoulder down the dusty main road as the picnic crowd gathered under canvas tents strung with bunting. Judith wore her work boots and best shirt sleeves rolled. Evelyn wore a plain cotton dress the color of river clay borrowed from Judith's chest, restitched at the seams. Her hair was pinned back, a few curls brushing her cheek, and her face was steady despite the eyes. Because eyes were everywhere. Some folks turned away, pretending not to notice. Others stared bold-faced. One woman, the pastor's wife, clutched her child's hand tighter and whispered behind her palm, but not everyone scowled. Martha Wiggins, the woman who ran the schoolhouse, offered a soft nod. Old Earl Dobbins tipped his hat with a grin, and Clara from the bakery gave them 2 slices of pie with extra peach on account of the wind being mean today. Evelyn stayed close to Judith's side, her hands folded, but eyes wide, taking in the laughter, the kids chasing hoop sticks, the sound of fiddle and banjo rising from the stage. She hadn't danced in years, not once without expectation. You sure about this? She asked under her breath. Judith scanned the field. It's your name on the paper now. You don't owe him shame. Evelyn exhaled and followed Judith to the pie table. That's when she saw him. Charles Whitford stood beneath the shade of the water tower, a linen vest tight across his middle, a fresh cigar in hand. Benton lingered beside him like a shadow. They weren't eating. They weren't dancing. Just watching. Evelyn stiffened. Judith followed her gaze and said, "Let 'em look." Charles didn't approach, not yet, but the glint in his eyes said he had planned this too. The picnic was more than pie and fiddle music. It was public ground, a place where judgment stuck like burrs. Judith knew it the moment the mayor, Thomas Brewer, stopped mid-conversation and looked their way. She caught a whisper float past. "That's the one Whitford's looking for." Judith leaned down to Evelyn. "Come with me." They crossed the green to the corral fence where children were tossing horseshoes and young couples twirled in the dust. Judith stepped up to Martha Wiggins, who was refilling lemonade cups. "You ever need help at the schoolhouse?" she asked. Martha blinked. "Sure do. Always behind on reading lessons." Judith nodded at Evelyn. "She's good with kids. Taught her younger brother back in Ohio. Smart, steady." Martha studied Evelyn, then smiled. "Well now, I reckon that'd be a blessing." Evelyn's voice trembled. "You'd trust me," Martha shrugged. Anyone who stands next to Judith Halley during a storm probably knows how to hold steady. From across the picnic field, Charles Whitford saw the exchange, and something shifted in his expression. Benton muttered something, but Charles shook his head. Not now, not in front of Pye and children. Evelyn turned back to the music, and this time she walked forward on her own. Judith stayed back as Evelyn stepped into the gathering crowd by the fire pit and served cornbread to a line of children, her hands moving with purpose. A little girl asked her name. Evelyn, she said, and smiled. The firelight caught her face as dusk crept in. Judith watched from a distance, arms folded. That day hadn't changed everything, but it changed something. Evelyn wasn't hidden now, she was seen. And the man who once claimed her with coin and contract had to watch as she gave away something far more powerful, her presence. That night, as the sun sank and lanterns swayed, Evelyn walked home beside Judith, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer. They didn't talk much, but both knew this freedom wasn't always won with shouting. Sometimes it showed up in borrowed dresses and cornbread crumbs. 3 days after the picnic, Judith and Evelyn rode into town side by side. They didn't wear Sunday smiles or quiet hats. They wore plain work clothes, dust on their boots, and a single goal stitched into their silence: make it official. Put the law in writing. Evelyn Kearns was no man's property. Judith guided them to the Mesa Ridge Courthouse, a squat brick building with cracked white columns and a bell that hadn't rung since the fire 2 winters back. Inside, the clerk behind the desk, a young man with narrow eyes and ink-stained fingers, looked up from a stack of receipts. "We need to file a protection notice," Judith said without waiting to sit. "Under Arizona Revised Civil Code Section 1298. The clerk blinked. "On what grounds?" "Threats, coercion, attempted abduction. Evelyn Kearns, single woman, citizen adult." She looked at Evelyn, who stepped forward and pulled out Hazel's notarized letter. "This says I'm not legally married. I want it on record." The clerk scratched his chin. "Well, all right then." He led them to a side desk with a thin file drawer labeled Protective Orders. Judith filled it out with clean block letters. Evelyn signed at the bottom in a careful hand. Then the clerk stamped it. Judith nodded once. That's all we needed. As they left, a woman standing near the door offered a slight nod. The town was watching, not just Whitford and his men, but others too, watching to see if Evelyn would keep hiding or stand. Back at the ranch, the air held that kind of stillness that meant trouble was looking for a match. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She kept looking out the bunkhouse window, fingers brushing the sill. Around midnight, a low pop echoed over the ridge, then a second sharper, closer. Evelyn jolted upright and ran to the door. Flames danced in the sky behind the feed barn. She didn't scream, she ran. By the time Judith reached her rifle in one hand, water bucket in the other, Evelyn was already heaving water from the trough, bare feet skidding in the dirt. Her nightdress was soaked, and her arms shook, but she didn't stop. Together they fought the blaze, coughing through the smoke, lobbing water until their shoulders ached. The fire didn't reach the house, but the barn smoldered down to black beams and scorched hay. As the sun broke across the ridge, Evelyn sat in the dirt, hair-matted dress, singed hands trembling. Judith dropped beside her. Evelyn whispered, "He did this." Judith didn't answer. She didn't have to. They buried the last flames in silence. By afternoon, Evelyn pulled on boots and walked out to the edge of the yard with a sack of seeds in her hand. Judith watched her go, unsure what she was doing, until she knelt in the ash. Quietly, carefully, Evelyn poked holes in the scorched ground and dropped in the seeds, squash beans, a little corn. Her hands worked slow and steady, pressing the dirt down. Judith walked over and stood behind her. "You think anything will grow there?" she asked. Evelyn didn't look up. "I don't know." Judith nodded. "Still planting anyway." "Because it's mine now," Evelyn said. "My choice." She looked up at Judith, and there was something in her eyes, something raw but rooted. "I can't stop him from being cruel," she said, "but I can choose what grows in the places he tried to ruin." Judith crouched beside her. Together they finished planting the row. When they stood, Evelyn wiped her hands on her skirt, leaving a gray streak across her thigh like a badge. That night, Judith sat on the porch, oil lamp flickering at her feet, rifle leaning close. And Evelyn, barefoot hair, damp eyes clear, dragged a second rocking chair out beside her. The land was scarred, but the seeds were in. And when morning came, no one could unplant what had already begun. The sheriff came just after noon, when the sky was hot enough to make fence posts sweat. Judith was hitching the gate on the north pasture when she spotted the dust trail rising slow and deliberate. The badge caught the sun long before the man did Deputy Frank York, tall, tight-lipped, with a hat brim wide enough to cover 3 lies. He rode up with 2 men behind him. Neither wore a star, but both had Whitford's smirk stamped across their mouths. Judith wiped her brow. "Frank," she said flatly. "Judith." He nodded, dismounting. "I got orders." She glanced toward the house where Evelyn stood in the doorway, hand curled around the post. Frank cleared his throat. "By authority of Mesa Ridge County, I'm placing you under arrest for unlawful harboring and interference in a contractual union." "That ain't a real charge," Judith said calmly. Frank sighed. "Got a signed complaint. Said you burned your own barn to frame someone, that you're keeping a woman from her rightful husband. She's not his wife. There's a notarized document at the clerk's office says so. I know, Judith, but there's pressure." Judith raised an eyebrow. From where you're standing, Frank didn't answer. He gestured, and one of Whitford's men stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. Judith didn't resist, but her voice was sharp as the snap of leather. "You put those on me, Frank, and you better pray every detail on that warrant's clean." At the station, she sat behind bars that smelled like rust and whiskey. The cell was small, barely enough space for the cot and her dignity. Sheriff Harding was conveniently out of town, sick mother, someone said, which left Deputy York holding the law by the handle and hoping it wouldn't swing back at him. Hazel Partridge arrived an hour later, with a bundle of papers clutched in her arms and outrage tucked beneath her scarf. They filed this under a 1909 statute, she said, dropping the documents on Frank's desk. "Problem is that law only applies within town limits. Painted Rock Ranch sits outside the boundary." Frank rubbed his temple. "That's a technicality." "It's jurisdiction," Hazel snapped. "You've got no grounds." She turned to Judith through the bars. "You want to press a countersuit when this is over? Let's just get me out first," Judith said. Frank read the statute again, slower this time. Then he pulled out a key. Back at the ranch, Evelyn hadn't sat down since Judith left. She'd split wood, fixed a broken hinge, scrubbed the stovetop twice. When Hazel's wagon finally creaked up the road, Evelyn came running. Judith stepped out of the back, hands dusty but free. "You okay?" Evelyn asked, trying to sound steady. Judith nodded. "Tired of iron, but I'm fine." Hazel stepped down from the wagon, brushing her skirt. "That deputy's going to think twice next time he tries to read law sideways." "Thanks, Hazel," Judith said. "You want thanks?" Hazel replied. "You give it to her." She nodded at Evelyn. "She's the one who came to me." Judith turned. Evelyn's eyes were red around the edges, but her chin didn't shake. "I figured if I didn't go, Evelyn said they'd just keep testing what we'd let them take." Judith smiled, slow and proud. "Well, seems you passed your own test." That evening, the rocking chairs were back on the porch. Evelyn brought out 2 cups of coffee. Judith watched the horizon where storm clouds sat heavy but unmoving. "They're not done," Evelyn said quietly. "No," Judith agreed, "but neither are we." Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, coyotes called from the ridge. The air smelled of burned wood and rain that hadn't come. And across town, word was spreading, Judith Halley had been arrested without cause and walked out with her boots still on and her head still high. They hadn't broken her fence. They'd tried her name, but not her will. And that folks were beginning to realize might be the one thing in Mesa Ridge they couldn't buy. The wind changed direction the morning Charles Whitford returned. It came from the south now, dry and hot, stirring up the grit around Painted Rock Ranch. Judith felt it in her bones before she saw the dust rise. Evelyn was kneeling by the squash mounds, her hands deep in the soil, when Judith stepped onto the porch with her rifle slung low and steady. "They're coming," Judith said. Evelyn stood brushing her hands on her skirt. She didn't ask who. They both knew. 5 riders crested the ridge just past midday, Whitford up front, smug beneath his white hat, Benton on his left, and 3 other men behind with hard eyes and gloved hands twitching at their belts. None of them looked like they came to talk. They dismounted without a word, boots thudding in rhythm across the dry earth. Whitford strode up to the porch like he owned it. Judith stepped down. She didn't raise the rifle, not yet. "You've made this a whole lot harder than it needed to be," Whitford said, voice smooth as syrup gone bad. "But I'm done with letters. I'm done with patience." "Then you're fresh out of options," Judith said. Whitford sneered. "This land's not big enough for both pride and protection. I gave her my name." "She never took it," Evelyn said, behind Judith, stepping forward with the shotgun in her arms. Judith didn't stop her. Whitford's smirk faltered. "You're pointing a gun at your husband." "You're not my husband," Evelyn said calmly. "You're just a man who thought money could replace love, and then got mad when it didn't." Benton moved first. His hand dropped to his side, fingers brushing steel, but before he could draw, Evelyn fired. The shot cracked like thunder over dry rock. Whitford screamed and dropped to one knee, clutching his shoulder. Blood soaked through his linen vest, dark and fast, but he was still breathing. Benton froze, fingers twitching over his holster, until Judith stepped forward and leveled the Winchester square at his chest. "Don't," she said, voice low. "We both know you're not that fast." Benton looked at Whitford, then back at her. His hand eased away. Judith gestured with the barrel. "Get him out of here, and don't come back." The men didn't argue. They lifted Whitford groaning and bleeding into the saddle and turned back toward the ridge slower than they'd come. Evelyn lowered the shotgun with trembling hands. Judith reached out and took it from her gently. "You okay?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn whispered. But she didn't cry. Judith slung the rifle back over her shoulder. "He'll twist it. Say it was ambush. Say we fired first." "Let him," Evelyn said. "I stood on my own feet today." Judith nodded. "That's more than he's ever done." They walked back toward the porch in silence, two shadows long against the dirt. By nightfall, word had already started moving through Mesa Ridge. Some said Evelyn went wild. Others said Whitford had it coming. A few said Judith should have just turned the girl over in the first place. But the ones who mattered, the ones who lived near firewood and milk cows, who knew how fast men like Whitford turned ownership into violence, they understood. The next morning, a boy from town rode out with a bandaged letter from the sheriff's office. No charges filed, incident deemed self-defense. The sheriff had finally returned from his sick leave, and he was none too pleased with how his deputy had twisted the law in his absence. Judith read the letter, then folded it into her apron pocket without a word. Evelyn asked, "What now?" Judith looked at the barn's empty foundation. "Now we rebuild, from the ground up. And this time no one would knock it down without facing the kind of fire that didn't come from matches." The sun rose slow and golden over Painted Rock Ranch the next morning, touching the burned barn beams like they were ruins of something ancient. Evelyn stood barefoot at the forge behind the shed, the coals red and hot, a small flame flickering like a heartbeat. In her palm, warm from her grip, rested the ring, gold, smooth, heavy, useless. She stared at it. Charles Whitford's wedding band, not hers, never was. He'd slipped it onto her finger in front of strangers and paper not love. It had lived more on her dresser than her hand, and now it was time. Judith stepped up beside her. "You sure?" Evelyn nodded. "I want it gone, but not wasted." Judith handed her the tongs. Evelyn dropped the ring into the fire. They watched as it sank into the embers and softened, lost its shape. Judith showed her how to feed the bellows, slow, steady, with purpose. As the gold melted, Evelyn reached for the old mold Judith used for tool handles and poured the liquid into the iron form. They didn't speak. When the metal cooled, Evelyn tapped it loose. What remained was no longer a ring. It was a narrow rod, blunt at one end, flat at the other. Judith turned it in her hand. You could make a handle out of it. For a gate, a tool. "I thought I'd use it for the cabin," Evelyn said. "Maybe the door latch." Judith smiled. A piece of him that opened something new. Later that day, Hazel arrived in her wagon with a rolled scroll and a firm expression. "The sheriff resigned this morning," she said, stepping down. "Didn't take kindly to how things were handled in his absence." Judith raised an eyebrow. "York, still deputy for now, but quiet." Hazel held up the scroll. "This here's what I really came for." She spread it out on the porch, an official record of property revision freshly stamped. "Joint ownership," Hazel said. "I filed it myself. Evelyn Kearns is now co-owner of Painted Rock Ranch. No loopholes, no wiggle room." Evelyn blinked. "Wait, what?" Judith met her eyes. "This land's never felt more like home since you came. Figured it ought to mean something." Evelyn stared at the paper, then at Judith. "You don't have to do this." "I know," Judith said simply. Hazel packed up her ledger, patting Evelyn's shoulder on the way out. "Folks in town, they're starting to change their tune. Watched you stand up to that man like you'd planted your boots in concrete." "I was shaking," Evelyn admitted. "Maybe, but they couldn't see it," Hazel said with a wink. In the days that followed, folks started dropping by. First came Clara with a sack of flour and 2 jars of jam. Then the grocer's boy brought coffee beans and canned peaches. A carpenter named Will offered to help with the new barn frame, saying, "You stood up when most would have sat down." Even the little girl from the picnic, Sadie, freckled and curious, rode out on a pony to ask if Miss Evelyn could teach her letters. "I want to write my own name," she said proudly, holding up a slate board. Evelyn looked over at Judith, then knelt beside her. "That's a fine reason. I'd be honored." That night, as the porch filled with the scent of stew and wood smoke, Evelyn pulled the iron latch she'd forged from the coals out of the crate. Judith nodded toward the cabin, ready to put it on. Evelyn smiled, fingers wrapped around what once was a ring. They worked together, hammering, aligning, fastening the new latch onto the cabin door. When they finished, Evelyn stepped back and turned it. It clicked smooth and sure. No more chains, no more keys held by someone else. Just a door she could open herself. The past hadn't vanished, but it had melted, reshaped, and cooled into something useful, something hers. And this time, it would hold. Autumn came soft to Painted Rock Ranch. The air turned crisp but not cold. The cottonwoods along the creek took on a golden hue, fluttering like old coins in the breeze. The mornings were quiet, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the clink of coffee mugs on wood. But something had shifted beneath it all. The ranch no longer held just one woman's footsteps. Evelyn was up before the sun now. She moved with purpose, hauling water, feeding chickens, walking the fence line. Judith sometimes watched from the porch arms, folded coffee in hand. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The cabin had changed too, not in size but in feeling. Evelyn hung a clothesline between the porch posts and stitched muslin curtains for the bunkhouse windows. She scrubbed the kitchen floor with lemon oil and taught Sadie, who now came twice a week, how to sound out words like brave and soil. Judith gave her a small notebook to practice in. Evelyn wrote her own name on the first page. Then, underneath, in careful print, Painted Rock Ranch, shared by choice. Judith found it later and didn't speak of it. She just smiled, folded the page, and tucked it into the ledger beside their crop records. One morning, Evelyn found an old rocking chair in the shed, missing a leg cracked at the seat. She dragged it out and repaired it herself, using scrap from the burned barn and a hinge from the gate Judith had planned to toss. When she set it on the porch beside Judith's, it creaked like it remembered something. Judith tapped the seat. That for guests, Evelyn sat. It's for whoever shows up and stays. That evening they drank coffee together, legs rocking in rhythm. Neither said the word love, but neither needed to. Some things didn't grow from declarations. They grew like the squash in the ash, slow, defiant, and beautiful. As word of Whitford's retreat spread, so did change. The sheriff's office hired a second deputy. Clara's brother Samuel, a quiet man with a thick notebook and little patience for backroom deals. York stayed on quieter now, but showing up early and going home with his boots scuffed. Hazel Partridge took over record-keeping for the school, and with the mayor's blessing, she helped Evelyn apply for a teaching license extension. Not official yet, she'd said with a wink, but you're already doing the work. And Charles Whitford, he stayed in his manor out east of town. No more visits, no more threats. Rumor had it, he'd gone through 3 foremen in 6 weeks. Benton left him not long after the shooting started work up near Silver Creek. Folks said Whitford still tried to hold court at the saloon, but the chairs around him sat emptier each time. No one had much patience left for men who bought vows and burned barns. One Sunday morning, Judith woke to the smell of cinnamon and something yeasty. She padded into the kitchen to find Evelyn covered in flour cheeks, pink eyes bright. Bread, she said, simply setting a warm loaf on the counter. Just felt like making some. Judith nodded. Smells like you've done it before. Evelyn smiled. My mother used to say a house wasn't a home until it smelled like bread and someone to share it with. Judith tore a piece from the loaf and passed half back. Then I guess we're home. They ate in silence, the kind that felt full instead of empty. Out front, the new barn frame stood half-done beams reaching skyward like they had something to say. Evelyn walked out and ran her fingers along one post, then looked back at Judith. We should carve something in it, she said. So, folks remember this wasn't given, it was earned. Judith handed her the pocket knife. You write it, you lived it. Evelyn knelt and carved one word, slow and deep, free. Behind her, the cabin breathed again. And for the first time in a long while, both women knew they hadn't just survived something. They'd built something, together. Ever seen someone rebuild from ashes with nothing but grit, kindness, and quiet strength? Drop a comment below. If you believe some homes are built, Not with lumber, but with love earned the hard way. And if you'd ride with Evelyn and Judith any day of the week, like, subscribe and saddle up for more true-hearted Western stories.